page 85. Life Against Death, Norman Oliver Brown, 1959. The Psychoanalytical Meaning of History. Part 2. EROS. Chapter 3. Sexuality and Childhood. Part 2. If we divest ourselves of the prejudice surrounding the perverse, if we try to be objective and analyze what infantile sexuality is in itself, we must return again to the definition. Infantile sexuality is the pursuit of pleasure obtained through the activity of any and all organs of the human body. So defined, the ultimate essence of our desires and our being is nothing more or less than delight in the active life of all the human body. That this is Freud's notion becomes abundantly clear if we examine the specific nature of the perverse components in infantile sexuality. They include the pleasure of touching, of seeing, of muscular activity, and even the passion for pain. It is therefore perfectly consistent, and implies no change of view, when in his later writings Freud added the term life instinct as synonymous with what he in other contexts called the sexual instinct, eros, or libido. And there is no difference between Freud's notion of the ultimate essence of the human being and William Blake's when he said, "Energy is the only life, and is from the body. Energy is eternal delight." As with the concept of repression and the unconscious, so in his concept of the libido Freud appears less as an inventor of unheard-of novelties than as one who grasped in rational and scientific form intuitions which have haunted the imagination of poets and philosophers throughout the modern or romantic period of our intellectual history. Freud and Blake are asserting that the ultimate essence of our being remains in our unconscious secretly faithful to the principle of pleasure, or, as Blake calls it, delight. To say this is to call in question the psychological assumptions upon which our Western morality has been built. For 2,000 years or more man has been subjected to a systematic effort to transform him into an ascetic animal. He remains a pleasure-seeking animal. Parental discipline, religious denunciation of bodily pleasure, and philosophic exaltation of the life of reason have all left man overtly docile, but secretly in his unconscious unconvinced, and therefore neurotic. Man remains unconvinced because in infancy he tasted the fruit of the tree of life, and knows that it is good, and never forgets. Freud is also asserting that in spite of 2,000 years of higher education based on the notion that man is essentially a soul for mysterious accidental reasons imprisoned in a body, man remains incurably obtuse and still secretly thinks of himself as first and foremost a body. Our repressed desires are not just for delight, but specifically for delight in the fulfillment of the life of our own bodies. Children, at the stage of early infancy which Freud thinks critical, are unable to distinguish between their souls and their bodies. In Freudian terminology, they are their own ideal. Children are also unable to make the distinction fundamental for culture, the reality principle, and the serious business of life between higher and lower functions and parts of the body. They have not acquired that sense of shame which, according to the biblical story, expelled mankind from paradise, and which, presumably, would be discarded if paradise were regained. Neurotic symptoms, with their fixation on perversions and obscenities, demonstrate the refusal of the unconscious essence of our being to acquiesce in the dualism of flesh and spirit, higher and lower. Thus Freud's doctrine of infantile sexuality, rightly understood, is essentially a scientific reformulation and reaffirmation of the religious and poetical theme of the innocence of childhood. Freud of course neither advocates nor thinks possible a return to a state of innocence. He is simply saying that childhood remains man's indestructible goal. His pessimism is ultimately based on his inability to see how this goal is reconcilable with man's equally deep commitment to culture and cultural progress. With this qualification, it is true to say that Freud takes with absolute seriousness the proposition of Jesus, "Except ye become as little children, ye can in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven." As a religious ideal, the innocence of childhood has turned out to resist assimilation into the rational theological tradition. Only mystics and heretics like St. Francis and Jacob Boehme have made Christ's ideal their own. Poets like Blake and Rilke have affirmed its secular validity. Rousseau attempted to grasp it in philosophic rational terms. Freud formulated it as an indispensable axiom of scientific psychology. This concept of childhood enables Freud to grasp a fundamental form of human activity in the world over and beyond the economic activity and struggle for existence dictated by the reality principle. For children on the one hand pursue pleasure, on the other hand they are active. Their pleasure is in the active life of the human body. Then what is the patterns of activity, free from work, the serious business of life, and the reality principle, which is adumbrated in the life of children? The answer is that children play. Freud is not merely referring to all the activities conventionally recognized as children's play. He is also making a structural analysis of the infantile activities which he insisted were sexual and perverse, of which thumb-sucking is the prototype. In early infancy the child, according to Freud, inevitably takes his own body as his sexual object. In doing so, he plays with it. Play is the essential character of activity governed by the pleasure principle rather than the reality principle. Play is purposeless yet in some sense meaningful. It is the same thing if we say that play is the erotic mode of activity. Play is that activity which, in the delight of life, unites man with the objects of his love, as is indeed evident from the role of play in normal adult genital activity. But according to Freud, the ultimate essence of our being is erotic and demands activity according to the pleasure principle. Freud has thus put into his science the famous conclusion of Schiller's letters on the aesthetic education of man: man only plays when in the full meaning of the word he is a man, and he is only completely a man when he plays. And, from another point of view, Sartre says, as soon as a man apprehends himself as free and wishes to use his freedom, then his activity is play. Sartre appreciates the concept of play because of his concern with the problem of existential freedom. Schiller appreciated it because of his concern with the aesthetic nature of man. But the same notion of play can be and has been reached by minds operating within the Christian religious tradition, and taking the Christian notion of redemption and regeneration of the flesh seriously. For example, the fountainhead of Protestant mystical theology, Jacob Boehme. I quote from H. H. Brinton. In giving the will primacy over the intellect, Boehme's system makes it supremely difficult to define the nature of the summum bonum, which is the end of all action. The essence of will is purposeful activity, yet such activity is generated by want. How then can we have activity as a final goal? Boehme answers by calling the perfect state play. In play life expresses itself in its fullness, therefore play as an end means that life itself has intrinsic value. When Boehme is speaking of God's life as it is in itself, he refers to it as play. Adam ought to have been content to play with nature in paradise. As God plays with the time of this outward world, so also should the inward divine man play with the outward and the revealed wonders of God in this world, and open the divine wisdom in all creatures, each according to its property. Adam fell when this play became serious business. Boehme had the divine macaron that a copyright to take the Christian promise of the regeneration of the flesh, the perfection of man in the flesh, seriously. As Brinton says, Boehme hears the divine melody, not from a choir of Protestant angels, nor in the Gregorian chant of the Church. It is for him das Freudenspiel der Gebarung, the joyful play of eternal generation. In other words, Boehme placed man's perfection and bliss not in a Protestant future life nor in Catholic sacraments, but in the transformation of this bodily life into joyful play. Heretical mystics of the type of Jacob Boehme deserve more honor than they have received from secular humanists. For modern secular humanist intellectuals have in the main followed Plato and Descartes over the abyss into the insane illusion that the true essence of man lies in disembodied mental activity. The philosopher's efforts to overcome the mind-body dualism in theory are betrayed by the philosopher's own practical commitment to the pure life of the mind. The rationalism of the philosophers has only led them further astray, and the irrationality of the mystics has enabled them to hold fast to a truth for which the time was not ripe. Perhaps the time is now ripe when the mystic can break the glass through which he sees all things darkly, and the rationalist can break the glass through which he sees all things clearly, and both together can enter the kingdom of psychological reality. The doctrine that play is the essential mode of activity of a free or of a perfected or of a satisfied humanity has obvious implications for social reform. Over 100 years ago the utopian socialist Fourier tried to work out the structure of a society in which work had been transformed into play. His influence can be seen in some of the early writings of Marx, which call for the abolition of labor as a necessary precondition for the emancipation of genuinely free and genuinely human self-activity. These utopian speculations have been laughed out of serious consideration by the realists, who apparently are made happy if they can prove, by their special interpretation of the doctrine of original sin, that their children and their children's children are condemned to be as unhappy as they are. But history is transforming the question of reorganizing human society and human nature in the spirit of play from a speculative possibility to a realistic necessity. The most realistic observers are emphasizing man's increasing alienation from his work, the possibility of mass unemployment, liberation from work given by modern technology, and the utter incapacity of human nature as it is today to make genuinely free use of leisure to play. The crisis of our time was diagnosed by one of the greatest and most realistic of 20th-century economists, John Maynard Keynes, in an essay written in 1930 and called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. Keynes takes as his premise the proposition that, because of modern technological advances, mankind is solving the economic problem, which always has been hitherto the primary, most pressing problem of the human race, not only of the human race, but of the whole of the biological kingdom from the beginnings of life in its most primitive forms. Keynes' reflections on this situation are as follows. Thus we have been expressly evolved by nature with all our impulses and deepest instincts for the purpose of solving the economic problem. If the economic problem is solved, mankind will be deprived of its traditional purpose. Will this be a benefit? If one believes at all in the real values of life, the prospect at least opens up the possibility of benefit. Yet I think with dread of the readjustment of the habits and instincts of the ordinary man, bred into him for countless generations, which he may be asked to discard within a few decades. To use the language of today, must we not expect a general nervous breakdown? We already have a little experience of what I mean, a nervous breakdown of the sort which is already common enough in England and the United States amongst the wives of the well-to-do classes, unfortunate women, many of them, who have been deprived by their wealth of their traditional tasks and occupations, who cannot find it sufficiently amusing, when deprived of the spur of economic necessity, to cook and clean and mend, yet are quite unable to find anything more amusing. To those who sweat for their daily bread, leisure is a longed-for sweet until they get it. There is the traditional epitaph written for herself by the old charwoman, "Don't mourn for me, friends, don't weep for me never, for I am going to do nothing for ever and ever." This was her heaven. Like others who look forward to leisure, she conceived how nice it would be to spend her time listening, and for there was another couplet which occurred in her poem. With psalms and sweet music the heavens'll be ringing, but I shall have nothing to do with the singing. Yet it will only be for those who have to do with the singing that life will be tolerable, and how few of us can sing. These reflections generate in Keynes a mood of anxious foreboding. "There is no country and no people," he writes, "who can look forward to the age of leisure and abundance without a dread." From the Freudian point of view, the necessary readjustment of the habits and instincts of the ordinary man appears no less formidable, but there are grounds for optimism not accessible to Keynes. For Keynes, the art of life itself, which in an age of abundance and leisure will have to replace the art of accumulating the means of life, is a difficult art requiring refined sensitivity of the kind possessed by the Bloomsbury group and immortalized in the work of Virginia Woolf. So Keynes looks with dread at the prospect of the ordinary man's emancipation from work. But from the Freudian point of view, every ordinary man has tasted the paradise of play in his own childhood. Underneath the habits of work in every man lies the immortal instinct for play. The foundation on which the man of the future will be built is already there. In the repressed unconscious, the foundation does not have to be created out of nothing, but recovered. Nature or history is not setting us a goal without endowing us with the equipment to reach it. But the concept of play is not simply a tool for eschatological prophecy and social criticism. It has, like all valuable eschatological concepts, analytical applications to history and anthropology. Huizinga and Homo Ludens elaborated Frobenius' definition of human culture as eins aus den natürlichen Sein auf Gestegen and Spiels. He shows the presence of an irreducible non-functional element of play in all the basic categories of human cultural activity: religion, art, war, law, economics. Huizinga suggests that the advance of civilization has repressed the play element in culture. The implication is that, since play is the distinctively human mode of activity, the advance of civilization has dehumanized culture. Take, for example, economic behavior. The element of play in primitive economics in potlatch contests of prestige, in the merry-go-round circuits of gift exchange is obvious. Perhaps primitive economics can be distinguished from civilized economics as that pattern of economic behavior in which play and the pleasure principle have primacy over the ostensibly rational calculus of maximum gains, that is to say, over the reality principle. Perhaps, more generally, the two levels of culture which sociology has distinguished under various labels, primitive and civilized, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, folk and urban, can be distinguished psychoanalytically. Primitive is that level of culture in which the rhythm of what Freud calls the primary process, the rhythm of dreams and childhood play, is predominant. Civilized is that level of culture which effectively represses the rhythm of the primary process in favor of rationality and the reality principle. The exploration of this hypothesis is part of a psychoanalytical anthropology. And is there no element of play in that triumph of utilitarian rationalism and the reality principle, modern economic behavior? 50 years ago Thorstein Veblen, in The Theory of the Leisure Class, exposed the irrational psychological springs of pecuniary emulation and showed that economic competition, not the theory but the practice, psychologically considered, is a game of ownership lineally descended from the barbarian game of predatory war. Quite recently economic theorists, abandoning the notion that the model of a rational utilitarian man can explain the actualities of economic behavior, have found their most fruitful alternative model in the theory of gambling and games. What then does psychoanalysis have to add to Huizinga and Veblen? The play element in culture provides a prima facie justification for the psychoanalytical doctrine of sublimation, which views higher cultural activities as substitutes for lost infantile pleasures. Thus French psychoanalytical study of money as a sublimation concludes with the proposition that the pursuit of money is governed not only by the reality principle but also by the pleasure principle, for is vindicated by the theory of games and economic behavior. Furthermore, the psychoanalytical notion of the repressed unconscious seems necessary in order to define the play element in culture. It seems to be an essential feature of the play element in culture, for example the game of ownership, that it must not be perceived or enjoyed as such. It is unconscious play, and at the same time it is never pure play. In other words, it has the same psychic structure as a neurotic symptom. According to basic Freudian theory, a repressed instinct is bound to return in the form of neurotic symptoms, compromises between the pleasure principle and the reality principle which are not recognized as such. And the neurotic symptoms are substitute gratifications. They provide pleasure, but only neurotic pleasure. Further psychoanalytical light on culture as neurotic play depends on the difficult and paradoxical concept of sublimation, to which we shall return later in this book. In the meantime, we should also warn the reader that to analyze culture or economic activity or even games as play, as a manifestation of EROS, without also taking account of Freud's aggressive instinct, Veblen's predatory instinct, is, to put it mildly, one-sided. Our indestructible unconscious desire for a return to childhood, our deep childhood fixation, is a desire for a return to the pleasure principle, for a recovery of the body from which culture alienates us, and for play instead of work. And yet, on the other hand, childhood cannot be recovered and paradise cannot be regained. For the infantile experience of freedom and absorption in pleasure has a fatal flaw. It has not come to terms with the reality principle. Later in this book we shall see that death is the reality with which human beings, infants and adults, cannot come to terms. The infant's world of pleasure and play is built out of wishes uninhibited by the reality principle and satisfied by unreal, hallucinatory fulfillment. Through an elementary mechanism, wish fulfillment thinking, which survives also in the daydreaming and fantasy of adults, the child is able to create a world where dreams come true and wishes are omnipotent. And by the same token this early blossoming of the erode life of man remains basically subjective. It fails to reach the objective world. The child takes himself and his own body as the object of his love. In Freudian terminology, infantile sexuality is fundamentally autoerotic or narcissistic. Freud is too realistic to follow the mystics or romantics who wish to ignore the demands of the reality principle. Infantilism, however glorified, is no solution. Hence there is for Freud a final contradiction between the reality principle and our unconscious desires. Here is the source of Freud's pessimism, and the central problem for anyone who takes Freud seriously. Hence anyone who takes Freud seriously must follow him into the closest anatomy of the desires of childhood in his terminology, infantile sexuality. Even in childhood, according to Freud, human love can be seen going out beyond itself and finding its first object in the world, the mother. Our analysis of EROS, even infantile EROS, is incomplete until we have analyzed this love of objects in the world, how it originates, and what its aim is. Page 103.